The book of Exodus begins to tell the story of how God rescued his people from captivity, a time of intense suffering on their part. Well, what does that have to do with us? How is that applicable to us? I find one particular passage in the book of Exodus to be a very important one that gives hope to us as Christians as well. In Exodus chapter 2, verse 23, we find how the children of Israel, the Hebrews, came to need such a rescue from God. And that verse says, "Now it came about in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died, and the sons of Israel sighed because of their bondage, and they cried out, and their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God." Now, in the next two verses, verse 24 and verse 25, God's response to that cry for help is expressed in four very important ways for us as Christians. First of all, we read that God heard their groaning. When they cried out for help, God heard them. He was not so far away that he couldn't hear them anymore. He was there, and he understood what they were going through. And then it says God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You know, sometimes the way we use the word or the way we understand the word remembered, we mean it as suddenly remembered, as in almost forgot. But that's not really the sense of the word as it is used here. When he says God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the sense of it is God did not forget. Now, as we read on through the story of the exodus of the children of Israel from Egypt and their wilderness wanderings all the way through the book of Deuteronomy, especially in the book of Numbers, it's pretty clear that the Israelites felt at times that God had forgotten them. But God did not forget them. He did not forget his covenant, but he kept his promise. And then verse 25 says God saw the sons of Israel. God was not blind to what was happening. And in fact, when you read further on into the story and you understand the total destruction that God rained down on Egypt, you understand how God felt about what he saw of the treatment of his people. But I find that the fourth response in verse 25 is the most powerful and the most telling about how God feels about how his people are treated. Now, various translations of the Bible, various versions of the Bible, translate this word differently. But the word, the Hebrew word, is yada. God yada. God knew. And by saying it that way, using such a simple phrase, God knew, is a much more powerful way to describe it than God took notice of or God acknowledged. Sometimes the people of God felt that God didn't know what was going on. Moses writes, God knew. How does that apply to us? What is the application for us? What hope can we take as Christians from this passage? Well, arguably, we live in a time where Christians seem to suffer more than perhaps at any time in our lives. And every indication is that it's going to get worse before it gets better. I would argue that the same four responses on God's part are present for the people of God today. When we cry out for help because of whatever suffering we're enduring, God hears. God is never going to be unavailable. God is never going to be out of earshot. God is never going to be out of the office when our call comes through. God hears us when we call, when we cry out for help. And God remembers those precious and magnificent promises that he's given us. 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 4. God remembers us. He's not forgotten us. It may feel like it sometimes. It may feel like we're in this all on our own. But God has not forgotten. and God sees. He still sees us. Every time someone is rude to you, mean to you, treats you horribly, God sees that. When persecutions come, if they come, God sees how his people are treated. And most importantly, when we feel we've convinced ourselves that God just doesn't know what I'm going through, Elohim Yada, God knows.